has been quoted as saying the Fed is not doing enough to boost the economy. William Denslow, our correspondent, joins us now live from New York. William, U.S. central bankers are worried about global trade disputes battering businesses and households.
That's absolutely right. Now, according to the Federal Reserve minutes, they do say with one strong caveat that as far as their research and data is concerned, they haven't seen widespread examples from major US companies of them cutting back when it comes to job hiring or them cutting back on capital expenditures. However, they are seeing, at least anecdotally, major concerns across US companies about these trade disputes. Now, quoting from the Federal Reserve minutes that were released on Wednesday, and I quote, they say that adverse effects on business sentiment, investment spending and employment, moreover wide-ranging tariff increases, would also reduce the purchasing power of US households. They say across the board, really, from the Federal Reserve members, that they see these global trade disputes, tariffs, as perhaps having downside risks to the US economy. So certainly major areas of concern that the Federal Reserve are watching very closely. They even say that if they see data that seems to point to these downsides to the economy coming into effect, they may indeed have to rethink their policy of gradually increasing interest rates.
Yeah, they're actually thinking about interest rates rising quite soon to counter excessive economic strength. That, of course, not going down well.
No, absolutely. There's been major political pressure from the Federal Reserve to reassess their view of interest rates. Now, of course, the Federal Reserve since 2015, when they first started to raise interest rates back in December of that year, they've now raised interest rates some 7 times. It's now slated that the Federal Reserve will go ahead and raise interest rates again in September. According to the Federal Reserve minutes, they widely tipped that they would go ahead and do just that. They said that no real economic data had been released since their last meeting in June to point to the contrary of them switching their policy of gradually raising interest rates. It's widely tipped that they will raise interest rates again this year, so 4 in total. But of course, this comes with it somewhat of a delicate balancing act. Of course, the Federal Reserve has seen interest rates remain close to where they want to see this benchmark of between 1 3/4 to 2%. However, there are concerns that if they don't move quick enough, the economy could potentially overheat. So this is something, a balancing act that they are having to assess. But of course, there is a clear message from the Federal Reserve. They're going to continue with their policy of slow and steady. However, some in Washington, most namely the president, aren't too happy with that proposal.
Yeah, now Trump, of course, taking aim at the Federal Reserve, many calling it a very unusual attack. You know, it's obviously having an impact on the dollar. And what are analysts saying about what he's doing here?
Absolutely. We've seen the dollar down for nearly a week now. And of course, President Trump has stated in the past that he wants to see a weakened dollar, saying that this would make the United States more competitive. But when it comes to Washington really getting involved in the business dealings of the Federal Reserve, this is certainly unusual. Normally, presidents very much try to keep out of, or perhaps should keep out, according to many analysts, of the dealings of the Federal Reserve. But this isn't something that's exceptional to President Donald Trump. Of course, just over the weekend, speaking to the Reuters news agency, he said that he'd prefer Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve chair, to not go ahead and continue this policy of raising rates, saying that it makes the United States less competitive with the likes of China as well as the European Union. However, we have seen over the years that some US presidents have taken aim at the Federal Reserve. Going back to Richard Nixon, he very much took aim in audio that was released a few years after his tenure, stating that he had a very direct attack on the Federal Reserve. The last real public attack that we saw from a US president pointed towards the Federal Reserve was back in 1992 with George Bush. So there certainly is somewhat of a precedent to this, but it's certainly seen by many economists a certain degree of furrowed brows about the president making such a public attack to someone. Let's not forget that it was President Trump that replaced the former chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, with his own pick, Jerome Powell. So certainly very interesting that President Trump is continuing to berate the Federal Reserve with this new appointee that he himself chose.
All right, thanks for that. Appreciate it. William Denslow in New York.